The fog over Route 9 wasn't the usual coastal mist. It was thick, yellowed, and smelled faintly of wet copper. Officer Arthur Penhaligon gripped the steering wheel of the cruiser, his knuckles white against the black leather. Beside him, Joshua, a rookie who still had the habit of checking his holster every 5 minutes, was uncharacteristically silent. "You smell that?" Joshua finally asked, his voice cracking. "Old pipes, or the marsh," Arthur grunted, though he knew the marsh was 5 miles behind them. The headlights of the Ford Crown Victoria struggled against the gloom, the high beams reflecting off the vapor like light hitting a wall. They were halfway between Miller's Creek and the town line when Arthur slammed on the brakes. The cruiser skidded, tires shrieking before coming to a dead stop. "Jesus, Art, what?" Joshua's sentence died in his throat. 50 yards ahead, bathed in the sickly blue-white glow of the headlights, something sat in the middle of the asphalt. Except it wasn't sitting on the asphalt. It was a casket, a heavy, old-fashioned toe pincher made of dark, polished mahogany. It hung in the air, perfectly level, exactly 3 feet above the yellow lines of the road. It didn't drift. It didn't sway in the wind. It was anchored to a space that shouldn't have existed. "Is that a prank?" Joshua whispered, his hand hovering over the door handle. "Some TikTok thing? Magnets?" "Magnets don't hold 600 pounds of wood in a dead air hover, Josh," Arthur said. He reached for the radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 42. We have an obstruction on Route 9, approximately 2 miles north of the bridge. Send a second unit and maybe the coroner." The radio hissed. No static, just a low, rhythmic thumping, like a heavy heart beating against a wet mattress. Thump, shh. Thump, shh. Arthur dropped the mic. "Stay in the car." "Art, don't!" Joshua pleaded, but Arthur was already out. The air outside was unnaturally cold, the kind of cold that felt like needles under the skin. As Arthur approached, he noticed the details. The silver handles were tarnished with a strange, oily black residue. The wood wasn't just polished, it was wet. A dark liquid was seeping from the seam of the lid, defying gravity by dripping upward into the fog. Arthur pulled his flashlight. The beam hit the casket, and the wood seemed to drink the light. "Officer!" Joshua shouted from the car. He had stepped out onto the road, his service weapon drawn and trembling. "Art, look at the bottom!" Arthur knelt slightly. Beneath the floating casket, the asphalt was cracking. Not from weight, but as if the space beneath the box was being vacuumed upward. Tiny pebbles and bits of glass were swirling in a slow, silent vortex toward the dark mahogany. Then the thumping started for real. It didn't come from the radio this time. It came from inside the wood. Boom, boom, boom. It wasn't a frantic knocking. It was the slow, deliberate strike of someone or something, using their entire weight to test the strength of the lid. "Unit 42, get back!" Joshua yelled, his voice rising to a scream. The casket began to tilt. Slowly, the head end dipped toward Arthur. The upward dripping fluid suddenly reversed, splashing onto the road with a sound like lead weights. The smell of copper intensified, now joined by the unmistakable stench of a week-old wake. "Joshua, get in the car and drive!" Arthur commanded, backing away, his hand finally reaching for his own sidearm. The lid didn't fly open. It didn't creak. It slid. The heavy mahogany slab moved sideways with a sickening, wet friction. From the widening crack, a hand emerged. It wasn't pale or skeletal. It was blue. The deep, bruised blue of a body drained of oxygen, and the fingernails were worn down to raw, bloody quicks, as if they had spent years digging through stone. The hand gripped the edge of the floating box. The casket groaned, the silver handle snapping off and falling to the ground. "Art, it's looking at me!" Joshua screamed. Arthur didn't see eyes. He saw a shadow within the casket that was darker than the night around them. As the lid fell completely, hitting the road with a thunderous roar, the figure inside didn't stand up. It uncoiled. It was too long. Too many joints unfolding like a dead spider returning to life. The entity's feet, blackened and bare, touched the air where the casket had been. It hung there, mirroring the box's impossible levity. Its face was a mask of stretched, translucent skin, and when it opened its mouth, the sound that came out wasn't a roar. It was Joshua's voice. "Is that a prank?" The thing mimicked. The pitch perfect. The fear in the voice identical. Some TikTok thing? Arthur fired. Once, twice, 3 times. The muzzle flashes illuminated the creature's chest, but the bullets didn't pass through. They simply stopped, suspended in the air an inch from the gray flesh, before falling harmlessly to the road. The creature turned its head toward Joshua, who was paralyzed by the cruiser's door. It began to glide forward, its body perfectly still, moving through the air like a needle through silk. "Josh, run!" Arthur lunged forward, grabbing the creature's leg to hold it back. His hands didn't feel flesh. They felt ice-cold mud. The moment he touched the thing, the world went black. The cruiser's lights flickered and died. The fog rushed in, filling Arthur's lungs with the taste of old dirt. The last thing Arthur heard before the darkness claimed him was the sound of the casket lid sliding back into place. And then, the sound of 2 distinct hearts beating inside the wood. When the backup units arrived 20 minutes later, they found the cruiser idling in the middle of Route 9. The doors were wide open. The road was bone dry, but 2 sets of polished black duty boots sat neatly in the center of the lane, side by side. There was no sign of Arthur or Joshua, but high above, caught in the branches of an ancient pine tree overhanging the road, was a single silver casket handle, dripping a dark, upward-moving mist into the morning sky. The coffee in the dash-mounted cup holder was stone cold, a stagnant pool of black sludge that mirrored the midnight sky over the outskirts of Oakhaven. Officer Carl Thorne rubbed his eyes, the grit of a 12-hour shift burning under his lids. He liked the night shift usually. It was quiet, predictable, and devoid of the frantic energy of the day. Then, the radio spat to life, the static sounding like dry leaves skittering over pavement. Unit 42. We have a 911 hang-up at 1422 Blackwood Drive. Neighbors reporting high-pitched feedback coming from the residents. Can you check it out? Carl sighed, clicking his mic. Copy that, dispatch. Heading to Blackwood, probably just a faulty security system. But as he pulled the cruiser onto the gravel driveway of the old Victorian house, a cold prickle of intuition crawled up his spine. The house sat back from the road, swallowed by overgrown oaks that looked like skeletal hands reaching for the moon. There were no lights on in the neighborhood, yet the air felt heavy, charged with a strange humming vibration that made the hair on his arms stand up. He stepped out, the silence of the night so absolute it felt physical. He didn't hear crickets. He didn't hear the wind. He only heard the steady thump-thump of his own heart. "Police! Officer Thorne!" he called out, his flashlight cutting a bright, clinical path through the dark. The front door was ajar. Carl drew his service weapon, holding it in a low, ready position. He nudged the door open with his boot. It didn't creak. It swung back with an unnatural smoothness, as if the hinges had been oiled with something thick. He stepped into the foyer and stopped. His breath hitched in his throat. The flashlight beam danced across the room, illuminating a scene of impossible stillness. In the center of the living room, a heavy oak coffee table was suspended 4 feet off the ground. A set of porcelain teacups hovered around it in a perfect mocking circle, their delicate handles pointed toward the ceiling. A stack of magazines hung in the air like a frozen explosion, the pages slightly fluttering as if caught in a draft that didn't exist. "What the hell?" Carl whispered. He reached out, his gloved hand trembling, and nudged the floating table. It didn't tip. It didn't fall. It resisted him with a dense magnetic pressure, pushed back by an invisible force that felt like cold water. Then, he heard it. A wet sliding sound from the hallway. Carl whipped the flashlight toward the sound. At the far end of the corridor, a shadow, darker than the surrounding gloom, detached itself from the wall. It wasn't a man. It was too long, its limbs jointed in ways that defied anatomy. It moved with a sickening liquid speed, blurring as it darted from the hallway into the kitchen. "Drop! Get on the ground!" Carl yelled, his voice cracking. He gave chase, his boots thudding heavily against the floorboards, a stark contrast to the silence of the things that drifted above him. He rounded the corner into the kitchen and skidded to a halt. The kitchen was a storm of domesticity caught in amber. Flour hung in a white cloud in the air, a bag having burst mid-fall. Cutlery, knives, forks, spoons pointed toward the center of the room like 1,000 silver compass needles. In the center of the flour cloud stood the shadow. It was hunched over, its back a ridge of sharp black vertebrae. As Carl's light hit it, the creature turned. It had no face, only a vertical slit that ran from where a forehead should be down to its chest. Inside the slit, rows of needle-thin teeth vibrated, creating that high-pitched feedback the neighbors had reported. The shadow lunged. It didn't run, it flickered. One second it was 10 feet away, the next, it was inches from Carl's face, smelling of ozone and wet earth. Carl fired 3 deafening rounds that should have echoed through the house. But there was no sound. The muzzle flashes illuminated the room, but the reports were swallowed instantly by the house. The bullets didn't hit the creature. They hit the air in front of it and simply stopped. They hung there, glowing red with heat, suspended in the air like everything else. The creature's mouth opened wider, the vibration intensifying until Carl felt his teeth begin to ache. He tried to back away, but his feet left the floor. The gravity of the room had failed. Carl began to drift toward the ceiling, his limbs flailing. He watched helplessly as his service weapon floated out of his grip, spinning slowly. The shadow looked up at him, its long, spindly fingers reaching out to pluck him from the air like a grape from a vine. As he drifted higher, his back pressing against the cold plaster of the ceiling, Carl looked toward the window. Outside, the world looked normal. The moon was still there. The trees were still there. But inside, the weight of the silence was crushing him. The shadow began to climb the wall, moving like a spider, its many-toothed slit widening in a silent, hungry scream. Carl reached for his radio, his fingers fumbling with the cord. "Unit 42, help, it's..." But the radio cord didn't fall. It drifted upward, coiling around his neck like a snake. The last thing Officer Carl Thorne felt was the absence of weight and the cold, sharp touch of a shadow that didn't belong in the light. The fluorescent lights of the 14th precinct didn't hum. They buzzed with a low, vibrating frequency that seemed to burrow into Kenneth's skull. It was 3:14 a.m. In the world of law enforcement, this was the dead hour, a stretch of time where the city held its breath, and the only sounds were the scratching of pens on carbon paper and the distant, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Officer Kenneth Vance sat alone at the sergeant's desk. The rest of the night shift was out on a multi-vehicle pileup on the interstate, leaving him to man the station. He liked the quiet usually. It gave him time to catch up on the mountain of digital paperwork that defined modern policing. But tonight, the air felt heavy, like it was saturated with invisible water. He rubbed his eyes, the blue light of the monitor casting a sickly pallor over his uniform. He needed caffeine. The precinct's pantry was a narrow, windowless room, tucked behind the booking area. It was a place of stained coffee carafes, half-eaten donuts, and the lingering scent of industrial-grade floor cleaner. As Kenneth stood up, his duty belt jingling softly in the hollow silence, he heard it. It was the sound of a ceramic mug sliding across a Formica tabletop. Kenneth froze. He was the only person in the building. The holding cells were empty tonight, and the front doors were electronically locked. "Hello," he called out. His voice sounded thin, swallowed instantly by the vast, empty hallways. There was no answer. But then came a second sound, the wet, rhythmic sound of someone or something lapping up liquid. It was a visceral, fleshy noise that sent a spike of cold adrenaline through his chest. Kenneth drew his flashlight, though he left his sidearm holstered. Probably a stray cat or a pipe. Bursting, he told himself, though his gut knew better. He walked toward the pantry, his boots clicking on the linoleum. The shadows seemed to stretch toward him as he approached the doorway. The pantry door was ajar, swinging slightly on its hinges. A sliver of yellow light from the hallway spilled inside, illuminating a cloud of dust motes dancing in the air. Kenneth pushed the door open. "Who's in here?" The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, hitting the far wall. The pantry was empty. The coffee pot sat cold on its burner. Everything looked exactly as it should, except for one thing. In the center of the small table sat a mug. It was Kenneth's personal mug, the one with the faded "World's Okayest Cop" logo. He had left it on his desk, 3 rooms away. As he stepped closer to retrieve it, the temperature in the room plummeted. His breath hitched, manifesting as a silver plume of mist in the air. The buzzing of the precinct lights grew deafening, rising to a piercing shriek in his ears. Then, the shadows in the corner of the pantry began to thicken. They didn't just move, they curdled. A mass of oily, impossible darkness rose from the floor, unfolding like a person standing up from a crouch. Kenneth swung his flashlight toward the corner, and his heart nearly stopped. Standing between the refrigerator and the recycling bin was a man. He was a full-body apparition, rendered in terrifying detail. He wore a police uniform, but it was an older style, brown khakis from the late 70s. The figure was translucent, like looking through a pane of dirty glass, but the weight of his presence was physical. But it was the face that made Kenneth's knees buckle. The apparition had no eyes. Where the sockets should have been, there were only jagged, blackened holes that looked like they had been burned away from the inside. His skin was the color of a bruise, stretched tight over a skull that seemed too large for his head. The spirit didn't move. It simply stood there, staring with those empty pits. "Officer?" Kenneth whispered, his hand finally reaching for his holster. I need you to identify yourself." The apparition's jaw unhinged. It didn't open like a human mouth. It dropped several inches too far, the skin of the cheeks tearing silently. A sound began to emanate from the creature. Not a voice, but the sound of 1,000 radio frequencies overlapping. Screams, dispatch codes, white noise, and the sound of a heart monitor flatlining. The spirit raised a hand. Its fingers were long, tapering into wisps of smoke. It pointed directly at Kenneth's chest. Then, the apparition spoke. The voice didn't come from its mouth. It echoed inside Kenneth's own mind, cold and sharp as a razor blade. "The shift never ends, Kenneth." In a blur of impossible motion, the figure lunged. It didn't run. It simply occupied the space where Kenneth stood. Kenneth screamed as the cold hit him, a cold so intense it felt like boiling oil. He felt the apparition pass through him, a sensation of 1,000 needles pricking every nerve ending in his body. He collapsed to the floor, the flashlight clattering away, the beam spinning wildly across the ceiling. When he finally scrambled to his feet, gasping for air and clutching his chest, the pantry was silent. The apparition was gone. The temperature had returned to normal. Kenneth fled the room, stumbling back to the sergeant's desk. He grabbed his keys, intent on leaving, on running until he saw the sun. But as he reached the main exit, he looked at the security monitors. The camera for the pantry showed the room as empty. But on the monitor for the hallway, the one he was currently standing in, he saw himself. He saw his own body standing at the door, and standing directly behind him on the screen, its translucent arms wrapped around his neck in a mock embrace, was the officer in the brown khakis. In the reflection of the glass door in front of him, Kenneth saw nothing but himself. But on the screen, the eyeless spirit leaned in close to his ear, its jaw unhinging once more. Kenneth reached for the door handle, but his hand passed right through it. He looked down. His hands were beginning to turn translucent. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was 3:14 a.m. He looked again. It was still 3:14 a.m. The buzzing of the lights grew louder. Kenneth picked up a pen to write a note, to scream for help, but the pen slid across the desk on its own. The sound of a ceramic mug sliding across a table echoed from the pantry. Kenneth realized, with a soul-crushing horror, that the sun was never going to rise. He was on the 3rd shift now, and the shift never ends.